Supplement to The Northwest Passage by Roald Amundsen, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Supplement Toward King Hakon VII's Land by First Lieutenant Godfred Hansen, Vice Commander of the Expedition, Part 2. On Easter Eve, April 22nd, there was a southerly gale and we had to remain in the tent. Eventually, on the Monday, April 24th, there was nothing to prevent us from proceeding. It was necessary to advance, and at first it was easy traveling. The mile down to the coast was a mere nothing, and the next mile and a half out presented no particular difficulty, but the route gradually became more trying, and we were at last brought to a standstill. I had to go and search for a path, and after forging ahead for some 200 yards, I reached a level track. But what a track! It looked level enough between the bends, but we continually sank in it up to our armpits. Indeed, it took us 2 hours to take the sledges over the 200-odd yards. Thursday, May 4th, was a great day for the expedition. First, we drove as we did in Simpson Strait in what we called the good old days, each man alongside his sledge and sometimes on it. But I had very soon to go on in front, as it was by no means so level down toward the land as it looked at first sight. There were hummocks and pack ice here and there in the ice fields, and to find the best course, one had to go on in front. The dogs seemed to have a most astonishing inclination to go northwest, and not straight out in the direction we wanted them to take toward the nearest land. When we came to an extra-large hummock, I wanted to go up and inspect the route. Hardly had I stopped when Ristvet called to me that he saw something dark which was moving on the ice a long distance away. What could it be? I almost felt my heart beating. It mattered little what it was. Any living creature out here in the barren ice fields offered prospects of further progress. I took out the glasses and found it was not one dark spot. There were many spots spread out in the form of a crescent over the ice. They were Eskimo seal fishing. So it was by no means strange that the dogs had wanted to go in that direction. We fixed the flag on the sledge, and as we thought there was a slight possibility that there might be white folk among them, we began to rub ourselves over with a little snow to remove from our faces as much of the soot from the petroleum stove as possible. Then we drove on again. Evidently the Eskimo had also seen us, for they came rushing over towards us, closing up as they approached. When they were all collected together at about 400 to 500 yards from us, they halted, and we did the same. Out in these wild regions where might is right, one never knows whether one is meeting a friend or a foe, so that it is best to be prepared. The usual formalities of an Arctic meeting had to be complied with. We drove the sledges up so that they were broadside on toward the strangers. Ristvet lay down behind them, with his gun loaded and the cartridges ready at his side. Then I braced up my courage and went forward with my hands raised above my head to show that I had no weapon. An envoy also came out from the Eskimo, holding his hands in the air, so that there was nothing to fear, and we met in the middle of the arena. His white teeth shone in front of me, so broad was the smile that spread over his flat, amiable Eskimo features. He was not afraid of me, and there was no expression of fear in his eyes at the sight of my strange features. Indeed, the dirt which covered my face was of the same kind as on his own. I returned his smile with genuine pleasure. Such a meeting at least indicated as much food as we could carry on our sledges. When we came up to each other, he said something about Kilnurmium Inuit, the name of his tribe. I understood that, because I already knew the name, and I replied that we were Kabluna, or white men. Then we embraced and rubbed our cheeks together. When you are in Rome, you must do as Rome does. He was my friend for the 2 days we remained there, and during that time he certainly thought I understood everything he said, merely because I had said we were Kabluna when he mentioned the name of his race. But of course, I did not understand a word. As our Norwegian Eskimo language was of no use to us, We could not get any information about the land further ahead, and any conversation which had a definite object had to be carried on by signs. When our two parties, that is to say, Ristvet and the other Eskimo, saw that affairs had taken a peaceful turn, they also approached the spot where we both stood, chatting and gesticulating eagerly. With joy and gladness, we all rubbed cheeks together and then started off to their igloo settlement a couple of miles away. We went pretty quickly, for they attached what dogs they had to the front of our sledges. When we approached the igloos, more people came out to meet us, which led to more rubbing of the cheeks, so that when it was all over, our cheeks were almost clean. We would not move into their igloos, as at that time of the year the snow house is a very miserable dwelling. The roof melts with the heat which quickly forms inside, owing to the temperature of the outer atmosphere, so that we preferred to remain in the tent which we raised, surrounded by a large crowd of Eskimo filled with curiosity. The spectators were highly amused, but fortunately we had Lily to keep them away from the sledges, so that we avoided any unpleasant results from their curiosity. There were about half a score of igloos, although some of them were empty, as several of the tribe had gone northwards towards Admiralty Island. There were about 20 to 30 individuals in this camp, and as far as we could understand, about a similar number had gone north. But on the whole, they were only a very small portion of the large Kilnermium tribe, which had come out seal hunting on Albert Edward Bay that winter. 7 of them had died in the course of the winter. The Eskimo who told me this laid his hand on his chest and coughed to show us the cause. It must have been some lung disease. They were, if possible, more primitive than our Nachili friends. They had to manage, to a greater extent than the Nachili, with copper knives and copper needles. But their bows were better, and it was clear that they had more facilities for getting wood. Their dress was a little different from that of the Nachili. The hoods had a blunt point at the back of the head. The waistband reached up high over the hips, but in compensation for this, the anoraks were cut off shorter, being even more like dress coats than those of the Nachili. I bought a seal which the owner had brought home with him, and paid for it with a knife about 2½ inches long, which had been made from one of our ice saw blades. It may have been rather mean, but if a transaction is honorable when both parties are satisfied, this one was so, because it would have been difficult to say which of us was the more satisfied with his bargain. I badly wanted the seal, and he, poor fellow, had never owned a steel knife in his life. Later we bought more blubber. The price for a half a side of seal was a 3-inch nail. But the price made even me blush. When the deal was concluded, and we had procured as much blubber as we could use, I gave the man a pair of surgical scissors as a present. Not only were he and his wife delighted, but the whole tribe rejoiced at the possession of such a treasure. When we were resting in our sleeping bags, we were constantly visited by some of the ladies, who brought us small mouthfuls of the cooked blubber from the front flippers of the bearded seal, which tasted something like pig's trotters. At first, we were innocent enough to believe that it was on account of our own personal attractions, but we subsequently discovered that it was some beads I had in a couple of matchboxes that were the main attraction. I made them a present of about half a score. I had to be very economical with them. Gradually the mouthfuls became smaller, but in compensation they were more frequent. At last we had to send them off without remuneration. This had the desired effect, and we were not further disturbed. For supper we cooked some blubber and meat of the seal I had bought. It was my first real meal of seal meat. I had certainly eaten seal meat before as steak, but I had never tried it a la Eskimo, and without any polar boasting I can say it was excellent. The meat tastes like mussels, and the blubber, when fresh, is just as delicate, though not so fat as pork. We had to be very careful not to put too much in the pot, for it slips down so easily that we run the risk of repeating the incident of the marrow soup at Cape Crozier. On May 5th we remained where we were. Indeed, it would have been difficult to get our dogs to move, as they had been allowed to eat as much blubber as they liked, and that was no trifle after their long diet on reindeer meat. But it had proved rather too strong for them. We spent the day in cutting up the meat and getting our loads ready for the next day. We had to repack everything now that the greater part of our cases were wanted for blubber. We removed the false runners from the sledges. We thought that the snow was now so wet that German silver runners would glide more easily. We had sufficient food for 1.5 months. We could not take any more because the sledges were full. We could have got more from the Eskimo, as they had been very successful with their catches, and they had large stocks of blubber. The next night we slept just as well as the first. It was pleasant to lie down quietly with the knowledge that we were now to go over the level ice of Albert Edward Bay and be able to make good headway again. There were probabilities of reaching new land, and these were pleasant thoughts to slumber on. On May 6th, we started off. Our friends were very contented with the few things they had obtained: a pair of scissors, a knife, a few nails, a matchbox of beads. What riches! They would never forget the day. I wished we could have given them more, but we were not equipped for trading. Indeed, we had never expected to meet any Eskimo, but we determined if we encountered them on a return journey to give them anything we could dispense with. With these good intentions, we started out on the ice. The Eskimo stood looking after us as long as we could see them, probably discussing who we were and what our real object was. Possibly, if they are left in peace in their poor land for another couple of centuries, 2 weird names, representing Ristvet and myself, may be handed down among their traditions. Our intention was to drive far enough into Albert Edward Bay to get inside the pack ice. We had had enough of it, and even if we were obliged to proceed right to the end of the bay, that would be preferable to shortening the road. But unfortunately, it would take much longer than following the direct route. On May 7th, we set our course direct for Cape Adelaide. We wanted to get on a height in order to have a view of the surroundings. We had long had to content ourselves with a poor view obtainable from a high hummock. We advanced over the southerly slope, which I fancy must be a paradise in the summer. There were already large patches quite free from snow, and some long grass was left there from the previous summer. The ground was certainly frozen quite hard, and the grass withered, but we conjured up before our snow-tired eyes fantastic pictures of green grass and rippling streams, of flowers and bilberries, of grazing reindeer, of hares tripping about, of lively ptarmigans, all bathed in the rays of the sun, just as it might be on a lovely August day. An entire Fata Morgana arose before the mind's eye, fortunately not altogether, however, for we desired some real ptarmigan and shot a brace. On May 8th, toward noon, I noticed some jet-black spots ahead of us. I stood looking at them for a while through the glasses, but as I could notice no movement, I concluded they were stones. Certainly they were very isolated, apparently some distance from land, but I had long ago ceased to judge of distances in the winter light. Besides, we were accustomed to great surprises in the shape of long, low projections of land spits, the existence of which we did not dream of till we drove over them and saw a stone here and there projecting from the snow. The sun had just come out, and we halted so that I might take the latitude at noon. While I fixed up the theodolite, Ristvet took the glasses, and he arrived at a totally different conclusion from mine. The stones moved. They were seals, 3 huge ones lying basking in the sun. Their broad, dark backs offered a good mark for the sun's rays. Anything white, such as snow and ice, throws back the rays of the sun, but black objects absorb them. There they lay, sleeping as seals do, for half a minute at a time. Every half minute they raise their heads, look around and sniff the air, and then they let their heads droop again. So they go on, without interruption, up and down, up and down. You must stealthily approach them when they are down, as then the seal neither hears nor sees anything. But it is all the more watchful when its head is raised. You must then lie as quiet as a mouse, concealed, if possible, behind some upstanding block of ice or other projection. But, above all things, keep quiet. The least movement frightens the seal, and however quiet, heavy, and sluggish it may have looked, it is gone like a flash of lightning. I was not, therefore, very confident in Ristvet's success, but it was well worth his trying, while I attended to the observations, and accordingly off he went. He had tied his dogs to the side of the sledge, and I had secured Scylla close to the stern so that she could not pull without hurting her hind legs. Gjöa had a noose around her neck. These were the two worst, I thought, and if they could not pull, the other ones would certainly keep quiet. But that is where I made a mistake. Just as I was lying down quietly to have a look at the sun through the instruments, which was standing upon a box at the side of the sledge, the box and the instrument received such a push that both toppled over in the snow in different directions, and away went the sledge. The dogs had heard the report of a gun, but I had not, and in spite of Scylla's and Gjöa's efforts to hold on, off they went in Ristvet's direction, straight along his track. But I was too quick for them. I got alongside and upset the sledge. I presume the pack ice had taught me that trick. In any case, I succeeded in stopping them. Ristvet's dogs, having to drag their sledge sideways, soon lost their inclination to run away. I then returned, set up the instrument again, and succeeded in getting the latitude. The instrument had fallen on such soft snow that it suffered no damage. After taking the latitude, I drove up to Ristvet. He had secured a bearded seal 7 feet 6 inches long and 6 feet around at the foreflippers, a regular mountain of flesh to look at. There were a number of small blocks of ice on the way near the spot, and distributed so favorable that Ristvet had succeeded in getting within range. Having selected one of the 3 seals lying round the hole in the ice, he aimed at its head and killed it. It is important to kill a seal outright. The shot must finish it off at once, otherwise even its last convulsion will cause its body to slide down through the hole in the ice, and then it is hopelessly lost. He had fired at the moment when it was looking up. It caused quite a thud on the ice as its head dropped. Every muscle was relaxed. He ran up to plunge the harpoon into it. It was provided with a strap, and we carried it for any contingency. However, he preferred sending another bullet through its head at close quarters to make quite sure of his booty. The size of the seal frightened him. Had he harpooned it, and had there been any life left in it, it might have regained consciousness for an instant and disappeared down the hole with a harpoon and line and possibly with Ristvet himself, if he had attempted to prevent it. The hole was large enough for that, over 2 yards in circumference, with an even slope, a slide on one side where the seals could crawl up. When the shot was fired, the other 2 disappeared from sight, apparently at the same instant. There must have been a little difference in time, however, as the hole was barely large enough for even one of the big creatures. When starting on the morning of May 9th, a fresh northerly breeze faced us. It was very cold, so much so that it was impossible to sit on the sledge, even with a full set of furs on, except for the few moments necessary for consulting the map. Whether the temperature was really 22 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, as we surmised, I cannot say. Maybe the high temperature of the past few days spoilt us. Now we had to find our way into the deep, narrow bay charted by Ray, which cuts into the land to the north from the northern coast of Albert Edward Bay. We wished to drive up through this bay, as I thought it would not be very far to the water beyond. Collinson had recorded a bay there. On driving for an hour and a half, we sighted land in the direction of our course. We approached it at a rapid pace, as the dogs had now shaken off the effect of their gourmandizing. It was no trifle they had managed to stow away, and at first it took some persuasion at the end of our whip to make them go at a reasonable speed. They could not understand why we should drive away from a spot where there was so much food. An Eskimo would have reasoned just the same, so presumably it was the most natural argument. It was civilization that prompted our longing to make progress. This was a thought worth keeping clear in one's mind. Sometimes it required argument to convince ourselves that we were civilized men. The picture I had before me in the person of my fellow traveler, and the picture he had before him of his companion, as also our utensils and housekeeping arrangements, all the fat and dirt, petroleum, soot, reindeer hair, and strips of skin, might easily make it doubtful. Our conversation about weather, wind, and hunting, that is, food, sleeping bags and dogs and nothing else, would sometimes make us feel as though we were simply what we looked. That we throve exceedingly well on this, that we thought we had never eaten better in all our life, never slept so well, that in reality only sunshine, warmth, and food comprised all that we expected from our existence, might at times make us afraid of reflecting on what we were doing towards achieving our aim in life. But then we would again ponder on the trodden footmarks of the two men in the narrow lines formed by the runners of our sledge on the verdant snow and the untrodden land beneath, the sledge tracks that ended at our tent, but which were to be continued tomorrow over the glittering expanse. After all, it was only a picture of strenuous endeavor. To take life as one finds it is called a virtue. Yes, of course, in a sense it is, but it comes very natural. Dogs have it, and the Eskimo have it. Men in whose hearts no such word as forward is inscribed rank no higher. By degrees, as the land began to loom out of the ice haze, driving became more pleasant. It was something more to look at than the flat ice which previously surrounded us on every side. To be sure, there was no rocky land, but there were hills and slopes, some of the heights rising to about 300 feet. We got up under the coast and entered a bay on the left, which we had thought of following. To all appearance, it was the only opening on the coast. However, on reaching the lower end of it, we found we were in the wrong street, and Ristvet mounted a small hill to reconnoiter. Thence he sighted the proper bay. He could distinguish the ice from the land by the ridge of ice extending all along the coast. This ice ridge is so formed that the sea practically freezes right down to the bottom in the shallow water near the beach. It is formed when the water is at its highest, the spring tides. At ebb tide, the sea recedes from under the ice, with the result that the latter, unable to support its own weight, drops down again on the surface of the water, and then it breaks off near the land, where it settles to the bottom as it cannot get away from the shore. The ice next the shore remains there, and the ice outside on the deeper water sinks a trifle more, thus forming a step, affording a means of ascending from the ice to the shore. The height of the step depends directly on the difference between the spring and ebb tides. Here the steps were a couple of feet high, and enabled Ristvet from that elevation to see that a narrow sound extended along the bottom of the valley. We had merely to drive across a narrow isthmus to get on the right road again. It was my intention to drive to the end of the bay, but on getting down on the ice we perceived near the other coast an island with a very peculiar erection, like a cairn, at the highest point. This, of course, had to be investigated more closely. The Eskimo do not build such cairns, they merely place single stones on top of one another. This one, however, looked quite monumental. We drove across the bay and pitched our camp near the foreshore of the island. Sure enough, it was a cairn, although not quite so high as it appeared at first sight. Across the top of the island there was a ridge about 15 feet high. At the western end of this ridge there was another pyramidal elevation, and the cairn, consisting of large slabs of limestone, was built on the summit. We pulled down the cairn. I have always had an objection to this work of demolition. Cairns, miserable stone heaps though they are signs of human beings, human work in the midst of the wild deserts. But that is not all. One's hesitation to take it down is due to one's veneration for the men who have been there before. These cairns meant something to them, just the same as those that we erect have a meaning for ourselves. Some difficulty surmounted, some step forward towards a goal. They leave a trace of our wanderings that is to endure for centuries when the snow has long since melted from under the sledge tracks and when our names have disappeared like the melting snow. They are a trophy of victory impressed upon land, won from darkness, from the spirits of evil. But the cairn had to come down, and we had to see whether it contained anything, perhaps a message from our brave precursor Ray. We found nothing, however. We thereupon descended to our camp. On our way down we saw a hare, but tried in vain to use Gjöa as a sporting dog. She did not seem to take the slightest interest in the subject, and when the hare took to its heels across the ice, we abandoned the idea of that little luxury. On May 10th, we placed a depot beneath Ray's stones. All that we had left of the dog's food, prepared by ourselves, about 100 weight, was deposited there. We proposed using it during the difficult drive over Victoria ice. We were kept prisoners for 2 days. During that time, we discussed what we should do in case the ice on Victoria Strait broke up before we reached home. It was just as well to talk about it some time in advance. However, now that we had made a regular start on the new land, and there was every chance that we could procure the necessary food for ourselves, we were tempted to prolong our survey into the spring. We left on the 13th. We had prepared the sledges on the previous night, and in the morning we were awakened by the ptarmigan outside our tent. It sounded very much like summer, but it looked anything but summer-like. It was a regular snowstorm, but having the wind behind us, we decided on starting. We passed over a few isolated slopes on the way, and from the summit of one of them, Alice Hill, we sighted pack ice in a northerly direction. We had another 8 miles to drive, however, before we got there. I may mention that there was no real bay where Collinson had charted one. He had drawn his map of this section at a distance. The point Collinson's farthest was situated some distance to the east of the spot where we reached water. From there he had taken the isolated slopes for islands and capes, and the low ground between them for water. The low stretches of lakes and swampy ground we passed could not possibly be distinguished at a distance. When a slope of this description extends out to sea, and when there is little difference between the ebb and spring tides, as is the case at that spot, one cannot tell where the land ends and where the sea begins, except when driving across the boundary line. We reached the beach close to a small headland, and thereupon branched off on the ice in a northwesterly direction. We soon sighted land, which, however, only consisted of a group of islets and skerries. Looking due west, we saw a higher point inland near the coast of the mainland. We drove over and remained there the night. Our observations during the day were not of much importance. The snowstorm prevented us from distinguishing anything clearly. May 15th was a very cold day. The temperature was down to 22 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. It blew a little, but the weather was clear enough for us to start. Before leaving camp, we fixed up one of our false runners on the top of the hillock to have a mark for the telescope of the plane table. I had previously noticed how quickly one loses sight of cairns of snow, even when built to the height of a man. It is impossible to distinguish them at a distance of a couple of miles, even in clear weather. The false runner was intended to help us recognize our hillock at a distance. After driving for a couple of hours, we reached a low, clear slope at the end of a headland, Cape Kofed Hansen. We erected a cairn there and drove across a bay, Holman's Bay, the second headland of which we sighted to the north-northwest. Midway on the bay, we stopped to survey. There were 2 points from which I could not see the far end of the bay, but when doing charting of this kind, one has not always time to enter into little details. The main thing is to get the coastline fairly outlined as far as possible. May 16th was another idle day, thanks to the frightful weather. It gave us an opportunity of looking after our clothes properly, but that was its only redeeming feature, for we had no time to be really idle. We were getting short of fuel. A couple of unfortunate upsets had lost us some petroleum, and by gauging our stock on May 13th, we discovered that we had only 1 3/4 gallons left. We must, therefore, economize. May 17th was Norwegian Independence Day. We began the day by breaking open a small box which Lindström had presented to us for this occasion on leaving. We had for some time regarded it with curious glances and tried to make each other believe that it was silly to be dragging it about upon the sledge, that it would be much better to open it at once. But fortunately it always happened that when one was weak, the other was strong, and when one was for opening the box, the other descanted on the enormity of doing so before the appointed time. The result was that the box remained intact. It contained a fish pudding, 2 tins of milk, some citron pudding powder, wheaten bread, and 6 cigars, the whole constituting a very acceptable present for gentlemen in our present position. We each lighted a cigar forthwith, and when we had finished smoking, we struck camp. The weather was not particularly fine, and we found it difficult to make progress from the very start. The snowstorm on the previous day had caused a quantity of loose snow to accumulate between the big drifts around the mountain of ice, and we had almost to swim through it, both men and dogs, to reach better ground. But, in fact, it was bad enough all the way. Sometimes we would drive a little way in on the coast, and sometimes on the ice again. It was equally bad on both, and we waded through snow knee-deep. We reached a headland, Cape Christian Mikkelsen. To the north of this, a deep fjord runs inland. Later on, the captain named it Denmark Fjord. At the mouth of this fjord, there was an island falling off steeply to the south. The island was probably about 180 feet high, considerably higher than the land along the sides of the fjord, seen from its summit. Remembering what day it was, I asked Ristvedt the name of the most important person who took part in forming the Norwegian constitution. Falsen, he said, and so we named the island. We then drove a little farther on towards some high land which we noticed on the north side of the fjord, but at 5 o'clock we halted for the day. It was the first time for many a day that we had halted to fix camp simply because we were tired and too fagged to drive any further. After we had had our dinner, Ristvedt made a citron pudding in our chocolate pot. Of course, we partook of it too freely. The weather was so fine on the morning of May 18th that we were in good hopes it had now set in earnest. I did some surveying, and then we proceeded towards the same high land we had been making for on the previous day. Soon, however, everything disappeared in a haze, and we had to steer our course as best we could from one section of the main ice to another. It is not very convenient to stop too often to verify the course by means of the compass. In such heavy sledging as we had to contend with there, the dogs seemed to become stiff-legged by waiting, instead of deriving benefit from the little rest. I thought I was now sufficiently experienced not to mistake land for water, however much snow there might be, but that was a fallacy. While driving merrily along in the belief that I was on ice all the time, a stone suddenly protruded from the snow. Evidently there was no water here. Soon after, I noticed a small piece of broken ice standing up on edge. Certainly this could not be land, but the transition had quite escaped my attention. I charted the whole as a ridge of skerries and islets around the north headland of the fjord, Cape Peter Anchor. I think this will turn out to be right when checked in the summer. We camped at Cape Nygaard. We had seen from Cape Anchor that the land ended here. It was a ridge extending from Mount Dierkenek, Holmfield, out towards Cape Anchor. Ahead of us we could see nothing. Sky, land, and ice intermingled in one indefinite gray haze. The clouds looked threatening. A large ring surrounded the sun in the afternoon. Cape Anchor lying behind us was only recognized from the fact that the shallows off the land at that point had stopped the larger ice, so that the field beyond was smooth. Only Mount Dierkenek, Holmfield, with its gradients, was illuminated by a strong silvery light. Everything pointed to bad weather. We were being dosed with it, and no mistake. On May 20th, we had for the first time a temperature of about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Sleet, a mixture of snow and rain, was falling when we awoke. The flakes falling upon the canvas of our tent were large, and every now and then they melted, leaving a wet, sparkling spot on the tent. Yet the weather was improving. The wind cleared the atmosphere later in the day. However, it was out of the question to think of moving before night. The wet snow would have formed big lumps under the runners of our sledge. We did not make a start till 9 p.m. The temperature had fallen during the afternoon, with the result that a crust of ice had formed on the snow, and this made excellent going. We spun along in magnificent weather. Heavy clouds were forming all round the firmament, the sun throwing streams of light and dark rays down upon the ice. It was beautiful, yet there was something uncanny, uncertain, and tempestuous about the illumination. We dared not hope it would keep fine for long, and neither did it. The sun set at 11 o'clock behind a wall of bluish-black clouds. We had been out some distance from land on a portion of the main ice, taking coast bearings, but now we set our course direct for a high cape. On our way we passed a long, low headland, Point Dietrichson, just as it started snowing. We built a cairn there, hoping that this was only a squall of short duration and that it would be over by the time we had finished our work. But it grew worse and worse, so we drove out into the haze of snow and were fortunate enough to get direct to the high land. It was an isolated hill, which I at first took for an island. It turned out later that it was the final spur extending from the slopes around Mount Dierknecht Holmfield. The cape, the most prominent point on the coast, was christened Cape Sverdrup. At 2 a.m. on May 21st, we encamped. The drive during the night had made us so sleepy that we cooked a little pemmican for our meal. We did not care to wait the hour or so that would be required for preparing meat from our fodder box. When we woke again, quite 11 hours later, we were very hungry. It seemed as if the meal of pemmican had not been substantial enough. We had only used the regulation rations, 14 ounces. This allowance included some chocolate, but we had not been able to repair it on account of the scarcity of fuel. We quite recognized that the ration of pemmican for the day's chief meal, 1 4/5 pounds of food, could on no account be reduced. We now treated ourselves to an extra cup of chocolate. It was rather a depressing thought that we should soon have to turn back. The bad weather had only one advantage. We were not tempted too far away from our base. Yet it was a pity to be reduced to finding consolation in a line of argument that ought to be foreign to a fit and energetic Arctic traveler. We escaped with 1 day of idleness at Cape Sverdrup. On the 22nd, we got away. With a fresh breeze straight in our faces, we proceeded over the broad, flat bay, Norway Bay, to the north of Cape Sverdrup. Before our departure, I went up to Cape Sverdrup to take observations, and came upon an old tent ring there. On the very top there was a huge boulder, on which I placed a long stone taken from the tent ring. This kind of cairn is visible from a much greater distance, and is more substantial than the ordinary ones. The land along the bay was quite flat, so also was the northern headland itself, Point Isaacson. When we reached this, I perceived Ristvedt running after me and stopped for him. He asked me to lend him the glasses, and I thought there must be something the matter. I glanced over the ice, however, and saw nothing, so I imagined he had made a mistake. But he had seen enough. "Bear," he whispered. His lips formed the words rather than uttered them. His sporting eagerness had got hold of him. He feared to scare his quarry, but this was rather unnecessary. There was a bear, no doubt, but it was a long way off. It was standing out on a large plateau of smooth ice, extending outwards from Point Isaacson, and meeting the pack ice quite near the horizon. Its head, poised on a wonderfully long neck, drooped down towards the ice. Its legs resembled 4 short columns. There was nothing very terrifying about it in that position. It was probably standing there asleep. Its yellowish skin was much the same color as a block of dirty pack ice. it was almost impossible to distinguish it from the surrounding blocks of ice. Suddenly it turned its head round toward us, and then we could see its black snout quite distinctly. No other object in this kingdom of the Snow Queen, no stone, no bare spot, no dark shadow is so black as the snout of a polar bear. It cannot be mistaken, even miles away. It looked in our direction. Probably it had heard some of our dogs barking. However, it soon turned its head away again and continued dozing. Ristvet took Scylla and went off towards the bear. When he got within a suitable distance, he let the bitch loose after showing her the direction. Away she went, slowly at first, but suddenly she seemed to catch sight of the bear, and then forward she darted like a black streak over the ice. I loosened more dogs. They had by this time learnt what it meant when Ristvet went off with his rifle. Like a flash they followed his track and passed him as he stumbled along over the snow away after Scylla. I noticed through the glasses how the bear again slowly turned its head toward the sledge. The dogs never barked. It was possibly by the merest coincidence that it turned its head, but the sight that then met its eyes soon made it lively. It wheeled right around and lifted its head, stood its ground, but only for an instant. By instinct or from experience, it must know the wolves that can chase even a bear till it drops from sheer exhaustion, though each one of them be such a miserably small creature compared to its majestic self. It now perceived a leash of 6, 7, 8 coming toward it at breakneck speed. Black spots dotted over the ice. Life was in jeopardy. The peacefulness of the desert was disturbed. Up it bounded, all its 4 legs off the ice at once, and wheeled around. Then off at a gallop toward the pack ice, full pelt, to save its life. Scylla was too quick for Bruin. Just before the bear could reach the edge of the life-saving pack ice, in the maze of which, where it was quite at home and within a yard or 2 of safety, the dogs could not have kept up with it, it was overtaken. Scylla bounded forward and fastened her teeth in its tail. The bear had to stop and throw itself round to shake off the enemy, and round it spun at such a rate that Scylla had to let go her grip and was sent flying on the ice. Scarcely had the bear turned to resume its flight than Scylla was on it again. This was repeated several times, but meanwhile the other dogs had caught up to the fugitive, and then there was no hope for the bear. The dogs surrounded it, and no matter to which side it turned, some dog or the other was at its heels. Through glasses I could see it spinning around, bounding off the ice like a rubber ball at a speed one would not have credited in such a clumsy creature. Its rage increased. Then Ristvet got up and fired. The bear was wounded, but not mortally. It merely rose on its hind legs and fought the air with its forepaws. The dogs closed in on it. Scylla, in her fury, sprang right at the face of the bear and received a blow from its broad paw. It must already have been somewhat weakened, otherwise it would have killed the plucky bitch outright. As it was, she took several minutes to recover. We had given up hopes of her. Her eagerness for bear hunting was knocked out of her now. The bear died in the belief that it had killed the enemy who had first overtaken it and stayed its flight from death. It was shot through the head by Ristvet's second ball, fired at a moment when the dogs were timidly holding back after Scylla had been struck, thereby enabling him to fire without hitting one of them. It was a lean young she-bear with no trace of food in her inside, and a curious hide-like layer of adipose tissue almost devoid of fat. We had bear flesh for supper. The soup was good, but the flesh was very coarse and stringy. Besides, it was so lean that we were soon hungry again, notwithstanding the ample helpings. To bring the soup up to the proper standard, we ought to have put a good-sized lump of seal blubber into the pot. That same night we had an illustration of the difficulty of gauging the size of things under certain conditions of light. We had turned in when Ristvet thought he would have another peep through the little hole in the door to see if everything was right, when he saw another bear. We opened the door in double-quick time, and sure enough, we saw a dirty, yellowish object running away on the ice. Peer, Bay, and Scylla were after it full tilt. Contrary to our custom, We had not tied the dogs up, as the bear we had killed was too large to carry away with us, and we did not mind the dogs having a feed during the night. In any case, they would find it preferable to sailcloth and tarred rope. Now they were after the bear in full chase. They overtook it, and then began to waltz around it in the same fashion as we had already seen earlier in the day. The waltz suddenly ceased, and the dogs came running back towards us, Per carrying the bear in its mouth. I don't know whether it was the light alone which accounted for this, or defective observation during our hurried preparations, or the blind sporting fever that undeniably seizes one when confronted with such big game as King Bruin, but we felt rather crestfallen at the finish when the bear turned out to be nothing more than a white fox. Full of the pride of victory, Per arrived with the fox in its mouth and laid it down. Next day it was consigned to the cooking pot. Fox flesh has a peculiar flavor, and the odor reminds one of the smell of a wild beast cage. Apart from this, it is, in the matter of fiber, the best meat procurable during the winter. Bear is stringy, ptarmigan is tough, and reindeer like firewood, but the fox keeps himself in good condition all through the winter, so that the fat is suitably distributed and the meat tender. There is not much feeding on him, as he is not much bigger than a good-sized rabbit. It was a trifle troublesome to get the dogs to move next morning, May 23rd, just as it had been on the other occasions when they had been allowed to eat their fill. They groaned and panted in the hot sunshine, but as it was nothing more than the headache following the debauch, we did not hesitate to use the whip to urge them on. We never used it as a rule, and of course we were more loath to do so when the dogs had been on short rations for some time. We made good progress today. The temperature had been 14 degrees Fahrenheit, but being a beautiful calm day, the sun had sufficient effect on the snow to cake it under the runners. The dogs suffered from the heat, so we decided to drive during the night in the future. On May 25th, it was fine all the day, and we expected the best results from our latest march. But we had hardly made a start in the evening before a bank of clouds rose very rapidly over the northern horizon. It was just as though the sun fell from the clouds, so quickly did they gather. Before we could count 10, the beautiful evening, with the glowing midnight sun and golden purple clouds, with all its other glories, had changed into a cold, clammy, dismal, dark autumn night. We had to get along, however, as we meant to cover another 20 miles. Now and then we adjusted our course by a pocket compass. To judge from appearances, we were on a bay. The ice was quite smooth. Soon after midnight we reached land, and then the fog lifted a little. To our astonishment, we saw land on all sides of us. We had driven into a bay that was completely landlocked. We called it Greeley Harbor. This would be a splendid winter harbor. It is the only good one on the coast. There was plenty of deep water, as we could see by 2 or 3 large masses of sea ice that had found their way into the bay. They must have been submerged quite 5 fathoms. The land on the west side of the bay was high, that on the east side also. Between 2 slopes there was a very low, narrow isthmus, over which we drove out on the sea ice again, and thence we followed the coast northwards. Unfortunately, it did not clear up after all. The fog again enveloped everything, gloomy, cold, and clammy. This damped my courage. Why struggle to advance when we could not even see land, and the most we could have done was only a matter of another couple of miles? So we halted and went into camp off a low rocky headland, very much like all the others we had passed. We called this Hansen's Farthest. Who has not at some time in his life stood overpowered with the conviction, thus far and no farther? Those who have know how depressing it is. We had long recognized that we could not reach our goal. When we were laboring and toiling over the pack ice out on Victoria Strait, we had more than once remarked that we would content ourselves with 1 or 2 days' journey along new land. But although we had done a great deal more than that, we were still rather disappointed at not having reached Glenelg Bay. We had to leave the 100 miles separating us from it in their untrodden virgin whiteness. We did not conquer them. On that day, when I closed my journal with the words, "Thus far and no farther," I felt almost as if the whole of our labor had been wasted. When forward is your watchword, your muscles are tense, your heart beats, the blood courses through your veins, your head is erect, and your form upright. But backward seems to turn you at once into a decrepit old man. It was some days before we could again reconcile ourselves to the words of Björnson's poem. Loftet hoved du raska gut, om et halb eller to blev brut, blinker et njet I dit oye. We prepared the following document to be left in a cairn. A sledge expedition from the Norwegian Gjöa expedition reached this point on May 26, 1905, and named it Cape Nansen. It is situated 72 degrees 2 minutes north, 104 degrees 45 minutes west, Greenwich. The coast appears to continue in a northwest direction. We are returning to the ship on this date, Cape Nansen, May 26, 1905. Godfred Hansen, per Restvit. Turning back, as I have said, makes one feel old and broken up, but turning homeward is quite a different thing. We were now going home in real earnest. Cape Nansen was our farthest point. The return journey would not terminate in Gjöahaven, it would continue in the Gjöa as soon as the ice opened, then onward, homeward. At Cape Nansen we secured a bear. It was on the 26th in the evening, just as I was preparing to strike camp. Ristvet looked out through the door of the tent, but instead of the sledges and the dogs forming a crescent around the tent and the fading outline of some hummocks, and beyond gray nothingness, snow and ice melting into a haze, instead of all this, he saw a bear standing some 10 feet away from the entrance to the tent. The rifle was always lying in the tent loaded. In an instant, Ristvet picked it up and fired. The bear fell, but got up again and hobbled away on the pack ice. The blood was running from its throat. We rushed out, barefoot as we were, to loose the dogs. But our hurry was unnecessary. The bear only got some 30 paces away, and then rolled over stone dead. May 27th. The land north of Cape Nansen was again quite flat. To the south I could see the high land surrounding Greely Harbor. The most prominent, however, was Mount Ovidius, towering high above the perfectly level plain extending for miles round its base. It is the most easily recognized point on the entire coast. I then returned to the tent, and our homeward journey began. At Cape Anchor we turned into Denmark Fjord and passed the night on Cloet Island, some 10 miles up the fjord. Although the weather was clear, we could not yet see the far end of the fjord, and we made up our minds to proceed some distance further up the next day. According to the map I had sketched on our outward journey, there should be a neck of land further in, about 4 miles wide, between Homans Bay and Denmark Fjord. I wanted to drive over there to check the work, which had been carried out only by means of bearings taken from the outside. It was surprising to notice, as we proceeded along the coast, how quickly the fine weather altered the appearance of the land. On June 1st, the sun, which was now visible in the sky throughout the day, was shining with its full force on the snow, melting it and laying bare the black earth underneath. As yet there were no running streams apparent, but the snow heaps continued to diminish every day. In places that were thinly covered, it disappeared altogether, so that the hill crests became almost black. We soon began camping on the ground, as we found that the warmth of our bodies penetrated through the sleeping bags and the tent floor and melted the snow so that the bags became damp. Camping on bare ground was therefore preferable. Even if the bed were not so smooth as it might have been, we were not so particular as the princess in the story of the pea, and we did not mind putting up with a small stone or so in our beds. We saw hares while proceeding down along the coast, often 3 or 4 at a time. Some of them found their way into our pot. It was difficult, however, to get within gun range, and we dared not be too reckless with our ammunition. It was meant for bigger game. Off Cape Kofid Hansen, we shot another bear. On June 5th, we passed Ray's Cairn Island and found our depot all right. The lemmings had had a few mouthfuls, but not more than we could very well spare. This is, I may say, an animal for which I have a certain amount of respect. Should anyone wound its spirit of independence by crossing its path, it resolutely rises on its hind legs with its back against a stone if possible. Sitting on its hind legs, it fights with its forepaws in the air for all the world like a bear, ready to sell its life as dearly as possible. As you stand in front of it, towering into the skies while the tiny creature only reaches to your ankle, you can scarcely help laughing at such a curious exhibition of courage. Nevertheless, it commands respect. We reached our depot of bearded seal on the ice the next morning. It took us some time to discover it. On June 11th, just after midnight, we drove on along Taylor Island. We found traces of 2 Eskimo sledges going south, and we followed them, hoping to overtake the Eskimo. For some reason or other, however, they must have been in a hurry to get south. Possibly they were to meet kinsmen and had postponed the journey as long as possible, hoping that we would return. They had made no halt for the night all the way down to DeHaven Point. From there, we crossed straight over to Lind Island, which was prominently visible to the south. We halted for the day in the middle of the sound. On June 14th, we tackled the pack ice. I had thought of it with some misgivings in view of the possible scars and inevitable exertions. We were, however, let off easily. In 2 days, we reached the land seen by Ray. On the first day in the pack ice, we caught a seal. It was most welcome, as the bearded seal blubber had become somewhat rancid. We had, in fact, seen many seals since we began camping in the open. On smooth floes of somewhat considerable extent, one could be certain of seeing seals that had come up to bask in the sun. They were very shy, and it was only possible to get within shooting range in places where heaps of pack ice had accumulated conveniently. We reached the land early in the morning of the 15th. It was only an islet, but we sighted land, large and small islands, to the north, south, and east. It was quite summer on the islet, hardly any snow, fresh green moss, ptarmigan, and eider ducks. To us it seemed quite a regular little paradise, and we named it Princess Ingeborg's Island. I determined its longitude and latitude. The charting of the other islands was done in a somewhat perfunctory manner, as we were, in fact, in somewhat reduced circumstances. We cooked with blubber, as we wanted to save up the remaining half-pint of petroleum, lest we should get such bad weather some day as to make cooking outdoors impossible. Our supply of bread was exhausted, and we had only 2 rations of chocolate left. They would soon be anxiously awaiting us at home. All this caused me to hasten our progress. We made a day's journey of 21 miles south, passing between a great number of islands and islets. For the last 2 or 3 miles we drove over a strait, Markham Strait, and I had an idea that there must be sufficient depth for the Gjöa. We reached Bride's Island, south of the strait, from the top of which I sighted several islands to the south, and at the farthest point, probably about 15 miles off, high, hilly land, apparently an island of some extent. I had an idea of examining the group of islands further southwards, and had started to do so, but thinking that the group extended right to the mainland, I concluded that the task would take too long, considering the advanced season, and I therefore altered our course northwards again to the east of the islands. We named the group south of Bride's Island Nordenskjold Islands. The group north of Markham Strait was named Royal Geographical Society's Islands, and the most prominent points of the islands were given English names. This seemed to us the most appropriate, as the land was first sighted by an Englishman. On our way along the east coast, we lost a dog. Ristvet had taken it out of the team, as it was impossible to make it work, and had only caused trouble among the other dogs. He was a reddish-coated dog with short legs, answering to the name of Inigseak. He had been lazy all the time, and as the dogs had for some time been fed on blubber mixture, it had grown rather fat. It followed behind the sledge for a time, but at last even this was too much for it. It lay down on the ice, and there it remained. We saw no more of it. We fully expected it to turn up at our tent in the evening, but it did not. It must have died there. Our consciences pricked us a little at first, but there was apparently nothing the matter with it when unharnessed. We therefore consoled ourselves with the thought that if it had died, its death was due to its own laziness. On June 18th, we started off across Alexandra Strait. The snow and the pack ice had altered in a deplorable manner. The crust of ice formed during the night was not thick enough to carry us and the dogs, but fortunately the sledges floated on the surface and we made some progress after all. At Cape Crozier, we found our reindeer meat, our petroleum, and our chocolate all in good order. Our privations were at an end. We now had the smooth ice of Simpson Strait to drive on, and made quick marches along the coast. One thing, however, was very embarrassing at this late season. Our dogs got bad feet. The snow was off the ice, and the ice water had rendered the surface rough and uneven, with numberless small perpendicular icicles which injured the dogs' feet. There was blood on the track after them, and one after the other they had to be unharnessed, first Mylius, then Gjöa, then Sella. We just managed to get them to follow behind our sledges. If traveling is unavoidable when the ice is in an advanced state of thaw, the dogs should be provided with suitable footgear. Otherwise, the work is too much for them. After a time, as we advanced, the features of the landscape gradually became more familiar. We had often visited the coast as far as the narrow part of the strait. After passing Todd Island and turning into Peterson's Bay, we began to feel quite at home. Our last camp was at Sforthia, the Black Mountain. On the morning of June 25th, we started on our last 10 miles. Our sledge flag, which had become somewhat tattered, floated over the sledge from the end of a ski. We intended to be seen by those on board at the earliest moment, and they soon saw it, as they were anxiously looking out for us. At 7 a.m. the flag was hoisted on board. Lund was on the lookout that morning and had seen us immediately. We learned afterwards how many times they had looked out for us on the ice, but in vain, nothing but the level ice and Todd Island in the distance dancing up and down in the haze. But finally we arrived. We entered the mouth of the harbor at 8 o'clock and soon reached the vessel. The dogs had suddenly recognized the place and realized that they were going to have a thorough rest. A man came down from the vessel, advancing toward us with long strides. It was the commander. "God dog, old Velkomen, good day and welcome," said he, and welcome we were, that was evident. The journey was at an end. It had been a trying trip. You have to keep wide awake when traveling in the deserts. Ever such a little blunder and you may lose your life. A mistake means death. However, it is a manly life. You feel free when out there, where will is law, even though it is hard, for the road is strewn with difficulties. One makes acquaintance with hunger, cold, wet, and fatigue. The fare is frugal. You have to say goodbye to cleanliness when every drop of water has to be produced at the expense of the most precious of all your possessions, fuel. However, on you go, and every mile covered seems another victory. And life? La vie n'est pas un plaisir ni un douleur, mais une affaire grave dont nous sommes chargés, et qu'il faut conduire et terminer à notre honneur. We had achieved this. We had charted another stretch of coast on the blank part of the northern hemisphere. We had caused new land to be trodden by the foot of man, and had made this land, its geology, its physical conditions, and its geography known. During our journey, we had covered 800 miles. Conclusion. As I sat out there on my sledge, without any guidepost ahead of me, the runners of my sledge making the first tracks through those fields of snow, I often thought it would be a good subject to write about on my return home. it seemed to me that our journey was not without importance. Though the coast along which we drove was stern, stormy, foggy, and icebound, both in summer and winter, though the land we wrested from the realm of darkness and mapped out on our chart was barren and stony, shorn of natural beauty, useless to mankind, yet it seemed to me that the infinite wastes gave birth to conceptions of greatness, beauty, and goodness. This was to be my theme. I desired so to write that those who read might enrich their ideas and gain some impressions, at least, of the stupendous, such as were conveyed to me in those pathless regions, where God's sun or the bright stars alone point the way. Now that I have come to the end of my task, I realize how little I have been able to offer, because the thoughts that to me were overwhelming are such as to find expression in the soul rather than on the lips. If, however, I have, to some extent, succeeded in telling the story of 2 men and 12 dogs wading through snow, crawling over ice, resting in the lonely tent, exposed to the winds, if I have only once succeeded in faintly picturing the impressions produced by what is seen out there in the endless expanse, in storm and in sunshine, I shall have done something more than add to the chart a few miles of land north of Collinson's farthest. End of supplement. End of the Northwest Passage by Roald Amundsen, Volume 2.